Great. Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining. My name is Dion Filmer. I'm the director of the World Bank's Development Research Group. Welcome to this policy research talk. These monthly talks provide us an opportunity to present work coming out of the research department here at the bank with the goal of sharing the findings with colleagues inside and outside the department, but also with others outside the World Bank. I'd like to welcome our audience both on WebEx today as well as YouTube. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Paulo Bastos, who's a senior economist in the trade and international integration team in the department. He'll be presenting insights from recent research on the implications of robotization for trade between developed and developing nations. We're very grateful to have Martin Reiser as a discussant. Martin is the World Bank's country director for China, Mongolia, and Korea. He was previously country director for Brazil, for Turkey, and then also for the Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova country unit. And he's also been an advisor in the Poverty Reduction Economic Management sector unit. For those who've been around a while, you'll remember that's the Prem unit. Martin holds a doctorate degree in economics from the University of Kiel in Germany. I'll ask Paulo to talk for approximately 45 minutes, after which we'll hear from Martin for 10 to 15 minutes. We'll conclude with the session with questions and answers from the audience. If you have a question, please use the raised hand option in WebEx, or signal to me in the chat that you have a question, and I'll call on you. If you're following on YouTube, please submit the question in the chat, and that'll be relayed to me. So with that, over to you, Paulo.
Thank you, Dean, and thank you in advance, Martin. I look forward for the discussion. So I'm going to share my slides. Countries around the world are currently preparing the recovery from the pandemic recession. And many are doing that with a renewed interest in industrial policy, with some degree of protection, with some support for their national champions. Examples of this are the recently strengthened Buy American legislation or the Made in China 2025. At the same time, physical distancing imposed by the pandemic accelerated the automation of industrial production and the digitalization of businesses. And the combination of some protection in rich country markets with the increasing resort to industrial robots to perform repetitive tasks that used to be performed by unskilled workers is raising concerns about the prospects for export-led growth and industrial development in low and middle-income countries. So in this talk, in the first part, I will review recent evidence on drivers of firm-level upgrading and industrial development, and then I'll review insights from recent research on the implications of robotization for trade between developed and developing countries. I'll conclude the talk with a discussion of policy options for promoting industrial development and trade-led growth that will be informed by this evidence. And so since the Second World War, there is a clear relationship between, at the country level, between the change in exports as a proportion of GDP and growth in income per capita. We see several examples of countries that had both an increase in export orientation and a great growth performance, including several countries in East Asia and Pacific and several countries in Europe as well. While correlation does not necessarily imply causation, we have recent evidence using changes in aircraft technology that allowed some countries to shorten distances and trade more, showing that trade has a sizable causal effect on growth, and this is this paper by Jim Fire in 2019. However, we also see from this graph that several countries, in particular lower income countries in Africa and in Latin America and other parts of the developing world, did not experience growth in exports and also didn't have convergence with richer countries. And to understand why, it's important to look at firms, because firms are those that are engaged in exporting. And this is a graph from the Export Dynamics database that my colleague Ana Fernandez is managing in the TI. And we see a clear positive correlation between the number of exporting firms and GDP per capita. So lower income countries have less exporting firms, and they also tend to have smaller exporting firms. And this is important because evidence from many firm level studies from many of these countries reveals that within industries and within these countries, exporting firms tend to be a lot larger and more productive. They are more likely to pay higher wages. They are also more likely to use more advanced technologies, and they are more likely to innovate. So the fact that developing countries, lower income countries have less of these firms acts as a drag on their aggregate productivity. And to understand why they have less of these firms, it's also useful to look at the life cycle of the firm. And in all countries, firms typically start operating small, but while in the US, they either grow or exit the market. In poor countries, many firms stagnate and neither grow nor exit the market. And this implies that at any given moment in time, because every year you have new cohorts of firms, most workers in poor countries are operating in much smaller firms that are less productive. 99% of the firms in many low-income countries have 10 workers or less, as revealed by this paper by David McKenzie in 2017. And so there is a growing literature looking at the drivers of firm level upgrading in developing countries. And this framework here is based on a recent review of that literature by Eric Verhoeven. And the notions of upgrading include the dimensions of upgrading, include the notion or incorporate the notion that firms in developing countries typically are not trying to push the frontier beyond, but they are trying to converge with the frontier. So they are trying to learn about production techniques, upgrade the quality of their products, adopt new technologies, and change the product scope. And the literature identifies several drivers of this upgrading process, including drivers of firm capabilities, such as the objectives of the entrepreneurs, their ability, agency and ownership issues, including foreign ownership, and learning within firms from other firms and from trainers and consultants. And there are also output-based drivers and input-based drivers, including exports, demand from local buyers, competition and reputation in output markets, and imported inputs and domestic inputs. And domestic inputs here include everything that you typically include in a production function. In the first part of the talk, I'm going to review recent evidence linking several of these drivers, showing that they interact together to generate upgrading in developing countries. In a recent work with Joana Silva, we used 20 years of workers' firm data for Brazil to look at this cohort of firms that was born in 2000 and 2001, and we are able to follow them over a long period of time. So we are able to see whether in the data, whether they became exporters or high growth firms. And we are also able to track to look at the attributes of the founders of these firms and see whether they differ from the ones that did not become high growth or did not become exporters. And we were also able to track their previous experience in the labor markets. I'm going to show you results for high growth firms, but the results are going to be qualitatively similar for exporters as well. And you see that, like in the cross-country evidence, we see within Brazil that richer states with higher income per capita, are more likely to generate more high growth firms per capita in this cohort. And we also see that the founders of these firms are more likely to have some higher education. They tended to get a lot higher wages, significantly higher wages when they start operating in the firm, and also when in previous jobs. In terms of experience, they are also more likely to have prior experience in the same industry and prior experience in managerial positions as firm director or manager. And so we found that there is a systematic relationship between these attributes of entrepreneurs and the likelihood that these firms become high growth or exporters. However, these variables explain a relatively small part of the variance. So we find that a lot of the variance remains unexplained. And this tells us that it's hard to predict winners, even with a rich data set where you have a lot of attributes on these entrepreneurs. It's hard to predict winners just based on example observables. And this is consistent with evidence from business plan competition in Nigeria. And so it's important to look as well to other drivers that may interact with entrepreneurial ability. And in this paper with Joana Silva and Eric Verhoeven, we looked at whether exporting to rich countries where consumers tend to have a greater ability to pay for quality, and they consume typically higher quality goods, induces firms to upgrade the quality of their products in order to appeal to these rich consumers. And to do so, they would need to use higher quality inputs as well. To produce a higher quality shirt, for example, firms need to use higher quality fabric or higher quality workers as well. And to test this hypothesis, we use panel data on firms' export transactions linked with product level information on inputs and outputs, or have prices of both these inputs and outputs. And identification exploits the fact that different firms initially were serving different destinations, and so they were exposed to different exchange rate shocks. And so we exploit this to generate exogenous variation in the composition of export destinations within firms, and see whether firms that were induced by these shocks to export more to rich countries indeed purchased higher price inputs. And this is indeed what we see in the data, that firms induced to export more to richer destinations tend to charge higher prices for their outputs, and also tend to purchase more expensive inputs. This effect on input prices tends to be stronger in sectors where there is greater scope to differentiate products. And so, based on the broader literature on upgrading, we can identify a mechanism of industrial development where exporting more to rich countries leads firms to expand the higher quality production that goes to export markets. And this requires the firms to use higher quality inputs, both imported and domestic. But because local domestic input suppliers are closer to these firms and can supply just in time, they have an incentive themselves to upgrade their production. And because they also sell to other firms will also be in better position to produce high quality products that they can export to richer countries. There is also evidence from a randomized control trial in Egypt that firms directly learn from exporting more to rich countries, so they move beyond the production possibilities frontier. They upgrade quality not just for export markets, but also for domestic markets. In related work, we also look at whether exporting leads to worker upgrading. Of course, labor is a very important input, and you'd expect as well labor to have to be more skilled in order to produce higher quality goods or to adopt new technologies. So we were able to link panel data on firms, workers, and worker level training activity from the main provider in Brazil. And we confirmed that exporters tend to be a lot larger, they pay higher wages, they are more likely to employ skilled workers. And the novel fact here is that they also are more likely to provide training to their workers. And the data comes from SENAI, a network of vocational schools managed by the National Confederation of Industry, that is the largest training provider in Latin America and the 5th largest in the world. And SENAI provides a number of technical upgrading courses that seek to update, complement professional skills acquired by workers in specific occupations. And in particular, these courses seek to focus on skill needs from technological innovations and new production processes. For example, for industrial electricians, SENAI offers an 80-hour course on electrical controls. Interestingly, SENAI is financed by a tax on firms. All firms, irrespective of using or not this course, pay 1% of their wage bill towards this program. And then the firms that feel the need to update the skills of their workers self-select into training courses. So we would expect that exporting, by leading to quality upgrading and potentially also to technology adoption, would lead more firms to resort to these training programs and upgrade the skills of their workforce. And we used again exchange rate movements to generate exogenous variation in export participation at the firm level. And we found indeed that exporting induces firms to have more workers enrolled in these technical upgrading courses, and especially workers that before were performing low-skill occupations. And importantly, we also find that workers that completed these technical upgrading courses within exporting firms, and here we use the employer-employee longitudinal data, experienced wage gains of about 3% on average. Another important source of learning for firms operating in poor countries are multinational enterprises. This is evidence from the CEP World Management Survey led by Nick Bloom and John Van Reenen, that shows that there is a clear positive correlation between management scores in a number of practices that are strongly correlated with performance and that have been shown to have causal effects on firm performance and income per capita. However, for multinationals, you see that multinationals tend to be always well managed. And this has to do with the fact that only firms that are quite well, have good performance and are well managed tend to become multinationals. And also with the fact that multinationals tend to come from higher income countries. And so within each of these countries, there is a lot of scope potentially to learn from these multinationals, learn about the best management practices. And also this happens because multinationals typically enter markets by acquiring existing firms. And so you'd expect them to transfer these practices to firms that were acquired. And we see that consistent with this mechanism, we see that in Poland, after the accession to the European Union in 2004, firms experienced rapid productivity growth. There was a strong convergence process within manufacturing and overall. And this process was stronger in sectors where Germany had a comparative advantage, was stronger to begin with. And we show in the paper that this was in part explained by the fact that in these sectors where Germany had a comparative advantage, where it had strong capabilities to begin with, there were a lot of more acquisitions of Polish firms by German firms seeking to integrate Polish producers in their value chains as suppliers and then exporters to the rest of the European Union market. This process started around 2001, 2002, when accession to the European Union was announced. And so using event studies and a difference in difference propensities for matching estimator, which is the best you can get here because these are large firms, we cannot really randomize for an ownership. We find evidence consistent with the broader literature that there is an improvement in firm growth, in productivity and in turnover. And so exports and foreign direct investment have been an important driver of upgrading and industrialization and growth. However, there are recent concerns that this process may be more difficult in the future. And this has to do with the fact that more and more it's possible and cheaper to use industrial robots to replace unskilled workers, where developing countries typically have abundance in low-skilled labor, to perform these repetitive tasks that before were performed by workers. So there are concerns that this process may be more difficult now in the future. And so automation is a trend that has been happening since the 1990s and has been happening in large part because robots have become a lot cheaper and better over time, and especially so relative to unskilled labor. This is for the United States, for example, that shows clearly a downward trend in robot prices, especially so relative to labor costs. And as you'd expect, robotization tends to be greater in high-wage countries because there you have greater incentives. The international price of robots is the same for all countries, essentially the same, and you have greater incentives to replace high-wage workers with robots. And this indeed finds support in the data. There is a clear positive relationship between robotization and income per capita. This evidence comes from joint work with my colleagues Erhard Tuch and Bob Reichers. And there's also an industry pattern where robots tend to be channeled to industries where these repetitive tasks that can be performed by robots, including assembling, dispensing, handling, processing, and welding, were more prevalent in the 1980s. And you see that there is a clear correlation between the share of replaceable jobs in each industry and the deepening of robotization. Now, as I said, robotization was already happening, but was accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic. As you'd expect in a recession, imports of most goods in the United States fell during the recession, except for pharmaceuticals and organic chemicals that were directly linked with the pandemic, but also industrial robots. On the supply side, we also see that one of the main producers of industrial robots had actually production grow during the pandemic, while all other machinery fell. In the OECD, there is evidence showing that robot adoption contributed to explain these two major trends that were happening since the 1980s. This is for the United States, that productivity continued to increase significantly, but wages of non-supervisory workers stagnated, grew fairly little over this period of time. Now, the drivers of this phenomenon are broader. It's not just automation, but there is a growing literature suggesting, showing that industrial robots were a contributing factor to both these trends, both at the industry level and at the firm level, and at the local labor market level. The evidence points to the robots being a contributing factor to these major trends. Now, for developing countries, a key concern is whether robot adoption in the OECD is also reducing the scope for exports of previously low-skilled labor-intensive goods. And we see indeed that developing countries have a relatively high share of exports in sectors that can be produced potentially by robots. And this is in particular the case for middle-income countries so far. So in this paper with Erha and Bob, we looked at how trade is impacting north-south trade between the OECD and developing countries. And we developed a Ricardian model where trade is driven by comparative advantage in both outputs and inputs, and where robots can replace labor in a subset of tasks in some sectors, as we saw in the data. The decision of using robots or workers will be driven by the relative prices of robots and workers in this model. And so in the model, lower robot prices would induce a robotization of tasks, particularly in high-wage countries and in sectors where automation is more feasible. And this has two potential effects. One is a substitution effect. So some of the imports that were previously sourced from developing countries can now be produced at home using robots, and doing that entails savings in trade costs. But at the same time, there is this productivity effect that had been documented in the literature, both at the industry and firm level, which induces an increase in imports from complementary inputs sourced from developing countries. Recall that developing countries have lower wages than high-income countries, and robots do not perform all the tasks that are needed to assemble a final good. And so what seems to be happening is that robots replace some of the tasks that were previously performed by unskilled workers, but many of the tasks can potentially remain being sourced from developing countries. And we take these predictions to the data using data from 95 to 2015. We use the theory-based IV, so where the incentives to adopt across countries and sectors follow this technological possibility of doing so across sectors, and the relative price incentives as well. And we find that the scale effect actually dominated. So far, and we also split a sample for the post-financial crisis period. So far, we actually see that industries that automated more in the OECD are actually sourcing more imports of parts and components, in particular from developing countries. So it seems that robots are performing a number of tasks that are complementary to these parts and components that continue to be sourced from developing countries. And so the net effect so far that we see in the data is actually positive, and it's positive for countries across the whole range of income. So we find positive effects on upper middle income countries, lower middle income countries, and low income countries. There is also recent evidence at the firm level that allows us to look at more directly at the mechanisms that supports this conclusion. This paper by Catherine Stapleton and Michael Webb, they look at Spanish firms that automated, and they find indeed that firms expand and they are more likely to source a greater share of inputs from developing countries. So far, the evidence suggests that the path for trade-led development is open. However, there are some important considerations. The distributional implications of automation and trade, and as we've seen, they are linked. It's hard to distinguish between them. Robots are actually imported in most countries. The distributional implications can fuel protection. This is these are results from a survey conducted in 2016, the year of Trump's election and the year of Brexit. And as you see, the proportion of the population in the United States and in Britain that believed that globalization was a force for good was relatively low. And we know that they are concentrated in areas where the political economy played in favor of these electoral results. We also see that in a number of countries that have more inclusive taxation and labor market policies, the attitudes towards globalization are more positive, like in Sweden, Denmark, and Germany. And we see that citizens in developing countries tend to have a positive, in particular those that grew significantly in recent decades, tend to have a positive attitude towards globalization, consistent with the fact that they perceive the benefits that it can entail. The second main important consideration is that industrial robots have a comparative advantage in this repetitive task, and they will continue improving. There are developments and projections that for sure they will continue to improve. And so sustained industrial development will require, most likely, an even greater focus on upgrading firms and workers. And here policy has potentially an important role to play. So it will be more likely difficult to industrialize and start exporting, just performing repetitive tasks that cannot be performed by robots in high-income markets. And finally, firms in developing countries, if they want to upgrade, they also may have greater incentives to adopt themselves robots. And this is not a bad outcome necessarily. It can actually be a good outcome for productivity, but manufacturing may generate less jobs than before. And this suggests that if it happens, and there is some evidence that this is happening, we need to pay greater attention to trade and FDI in services, because a greater proportion of the workforce will be moving to services early on in the development process. With regard to services, the pandemic also accelerated two emerging trends as well. One was the digitalization of business. There is a greater proportion of interactions that are digital now, and this potential for remote work that is particularly high in sectors, in high-skill sectors such as finance and insurance, management, professional, scientific and technical services, and IT and telecommunications. And so if work can be done remotely, in principle, it can also be done from other countries. And this represents an opportunity to export services that was already present, but the pandemic may have accelerated. Of course, there are barriers of doing so. It's not the same working remotely in the same countries. But once firms, multinational firms in particular, start using remote work, they might reconsider doing it from countries where wages are lower and skills are available. And so this raises many important regulatory issues such as data localization, privacy, labor laws, and taxation. And this is an area where I'm planning to do research, but it will require substantial data collection efforts. We started this agenda with looking at whether these sectors where there is more potential for remote working have greater potential for learning by working. And we use the Brazilian employer-employee data for manufacturing services, and we exploited worker mobility across sector, accounting for worker and firm observables, worker fixed effects, and location fixed effects. And we allowed these wage profiles associated with experience in the sector to vary depending on whether the worker is currently employed in the sector or not. And we see that the left graph shows the increase in wages associated with experience in a particular sector if the worker is employed there. And in the other, the right-hand side, we see the same outcome, but if the worker has moved to another sector. And we see that this potential for learning as measured by wage increases with experience is particularly high in these high skill sectors that have great potential for remote work. And this suggests that there are indeed opportunities to attract multinational firms and to do exports of services in these sectors, and these are jobs that generate significant learning over time. There is also related evidence for big cities and importantly for globally engaged firms. So evidence suggesting that these wage profiles tend to be steeper when workers are working for multinational firms. So to summarize, I presented evidence that the human capital of entrepreneurs matters for firm growth and export participation, but export success is difficult to predict. It's hard for governments to identify exactly which firms will be most likely to succeed. I also presented evidence that exporting to rich countries has potentially magnification and learning effects through quality upgrading, input-output linkages, and worker training. I presented evidence of firm-level upgrading through foreign acquisitions. So acquisitions lead to transfer of management practices and technologies to acquired firms in developing countries. And there is also related evidence on spillovers to local input suppliers. Robotization is seen as a threat, and we cannot exclude the possibility that it will make it more difficult for some countries and in some sectors to have export-led growth. But so far, we don't see evidence that suggests that it changes considerably this channel as for growth. We see actually that in the data, it seems to promote exports of developing countries in parts of components. But it will likely make the upgrading of firms and workers in developing countries even more important than before. And finally, I presented evidence on transferable learning by working in high-skilled service sectors, global firms, and big cities. I'll conclude the talk then with a discussion of implications for industrial development policy. So the evidence overall suggests that promoting industrial development and openness-led growth requires coherent policies in several domains. Trade and investment and transport and logistics to facilitate trade, but also then policies that act on the quality of inputs that firms have access to. And these include education and labor markets. We saw evidence on training, but also competition that affects the prices and quality of inputs that firms have access to in the domestic market. And regional development and innovation, I didn't present a lot of evidence, but the broader literature suggests that these input-output linkages happen within well-defined regions and also foster innovation, in particular in middle and high-income countries. And so I'll conclude the talk by contrasting two main policy options that have been advanced for promoting industrial development through trade, through openness, or through trade-related drivers. One that, as I mentioned in the beginning, is gaining more attention recently, not just in high-income markets like the US or middle-income countries like China, but also in other parts of the world, is a combination of subsidies and some form of temporary protection. And theoretically, the support for infant industries in developing countries can promote industrial development. There is historical evidence that it did so in certain circumstances. However, there are a number of important challenges in implementing these types of policies. One is that it's very difficult for governments to pick winners. So governments are typically not better informed than firms. And as we saw, there is evidence that a few firms within each sector actually become high growth, succeed, and are able to export. The second is that government may be captured by the firms and industries that they are supposed to regulate. And either of these potential difficulties leads to inefficiency and misallocation, and leads to more expensive inputs and outputs. And many countries, for example, in Latin America that tried this policy, still today pay much more expensive, much higher prices for essential goods for upgrading, such as computers or software or other technologies. And this drags down the upgrading process of other firms in other industries. And the final caveat is that the idea of this policy option or the intention is to protect sectors temporarily until they achieve a certain scale and then they can compete internationally. However, the evidence is that protection is most often not temporary. Once it is in place, firms will lobby for it to remain in place for a long period of time. And so given the evidence and these caveats, the option that seems more promising for promoting industrial development is to embrace openness through trade liberalization and facilitation, and at the same time use existing government structures such as diplomatic services to facilitate exports and attract foreign investment. We saw evidence that inputs are quite important for the trading process, and trade liberalization and facilitation would reduce input costs and improve their quality, allowing firms to have access to imported technologies, materials, and components that are important for their upgrading. We saw evidence that there are benefits of exports and FDI for firm and industry performance. And these policies do not need to be very expensive because these government structures are already existing, and diplomatic services and potentially NGOs can reduce information frictions and facilitate buyer-seller matches, facilitating entry and growth of firms in export markets. And finally, importantly, export and investment promotion can benefit from and magnify the effects of quasi-horizontal policies such as education, training, innovation, finance, and infrastructure, because these globally engaged firms are more likely to use highly educated workers to resort to training, to innovate, and to benefit from finance and infrastructure. With regard to export promotion, the evidence suggests that if governments are resource constrained, they should prioritize high-income markets because those are the markets where the learning potential is greater, and there are these magnification effects that I mentioned. In doing so, they should avoid picking winners because it's quite hard to predict export success, just like it is hard to predict firm success in general. And assistance is potentially subject to capture, which would lead to also to misallocation in the domestic market because exporting firms are quite large and they sell a significant proportion of their output in the domestic markets. Programs should involve key industry players in program design, but be aware of international best practices. And this is an area where the bank has an important role to play. And it's not necessary to pick winners, so it's possible to let firms self-select into these information-based programs. The firms that feel that they will have an advantage in resorting to buyer-seller matches and to information provided by diplomatic services or NGOs can self-select into these programs. However, it's important, of course, to continuously evaluate these efforts, create transparent mechanisms for assisting firms, but then using ICT and big data in real time to do impact evaluations, such as the one that we did for Brazil on training, and also use randomized controlled trials. And it's possible, has been done, but there is a lot of scope to do more. And finally, it's important to bear in mind that there are these magnification and learning externalities. So it's important to be mindful of input-output linkages, the potential for localized spillovers, and this potential for amplification and learning externalities in specific sectors and regions. To conclude, with regard to foreign investment promotion, in this case, targeting multinationals may be feasible and may be optimal. And the reason is that it's well known who are the top multinationals in each sector, and where there are a number of rankings and a number of indicators that one can use to identify who are the leading multinational firms. And so it's possible to target these firms. Again, government should be mindful of input-output linkages, the potential for spillovers, and potential for amplification and learning externalities in specific sectors, firms, and regions. The evidence on investment promotion agencies suggests that they must be high quality agencies with business people that can speak the same language as these multinational firms, and that they should have a long time horizon. So not just doing the work before the fund comes to the country, but also giving assistance ex-post. And they can play an important role in particular in reducing the information frictions that exist about how to deal with red tape and a number of other bureaucratic issues in developing countries. Again, it's important to create transparent mechanisms for attracting foreign firms using ICT and big data in real time for impact evaluations. It's quite difficult to randomize foreign ownership in large firms, but it's possible to use randomized control trials to study mechanisms, for example, within these firms or linking these firms to local suppliers. And finally, while tax policies have played a role in attracting multinationals, they also play a role in funding a number of public services that are important for multinationals to feel attracted by the country, and also more general for society at large. And of course, they have distributional implications that may backfire against this type of policies and can generate anti-globalization and anti-multinational attitudes and therefore backfire against these policies. So it's important to adopt sustainable, fair, and transparent tax policies. So I'll conclude here and look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Paulo, and thanks for packing in a lot of research there into a pretty efficient set of slides. So thanks for that. Martin, over to you for your reactions and discussion.
Thanks a lot, Dion, and thanks, Paulo. It's indeed, as Dion said, it's a great, very rich set of papers and impressive research agenda. I mean, I'm not gonna try and comment on the individual papers. Because I feel largely incompetent to talk about the methodology and the robustness of the results. I've read them with great interest, but I'm going to focus my remarks more on the policy conclusions that come from that, because I guess that's the perspective from a country director's point of view that may be more interesting. Fundamentally, I think, I'm afraid it's going to be a boring comment, because fundamentally I agree with you, Paulo. I don't think the trend that we're seeing towards, a revival of industrial policy is particularly well motivated by the empirical evidence. Although I will have a word to say about the specific experience of China, and I think the way that I would summarize this is actually very similar to Indemit Gill's comments when Justin Lin was leaving the bank. Indemit was asked to comment on the significance of the new structural economics, and he said it's a little bit like stone soup. You can make a wonderful stone soup if you have meat and vegetables and a good stock and some garlic and some spices. And then if you put a stone in it, it really tastes like very nice soup. And the stone in this case is industrial policy. So and this brings me to the experience of China and perhaps more generally East Asia, you do these quasi-horizontal policies really well. You invest in education, you have good infrastructure investment, you have a reasonably competent government that doesn't change the rules all the time. You have reasonably well-managed macroeconomic policies, create predictable macroeconomic environment. Then if you try and solve coordination problems or information problems through an industrial policy intervention, or if in that context you provide some element of subsidy to a particular industry, maybe not to a particular firm, but to a particular industry where you think you have a comparative advantage to help it grow, it may not do harm, it may even work. But the idea that you can substitute, all of the nice ingredients in stone soup for the stone alone, I think is the problem. And these horizontal policies, the attractiveness of industrial policy is that the horizontal policies are difficult. They're not easy. It's not easy to have a good education system. It's not easy to have a good infrastructure system. I see Ottaviano is connected. I mean, how long has it been since Brazil has been trying to improve its infrastructure and hasn't really been able to do it? Like left government, right government, it's been extraordinarily difficult for all sorts of reasons. We don't need to go into the details, but so you don't have good infrastructure, you have a lousy education system, and someone comes along and says, yeah, but China did it through protection, it's did it through subsidies. That becomes very attractive, of course. But they forget that China also has a very reasonable education system and also invests a lot in infrastructure. So my sense is one of the answers to that basic debate may have to be for us to have another interpretation of what the East Asian growth success actually is. And to test whether the stone soup hypothesis is correct. My sense is if you look at the data more closely, and I've done this in a blog recently for China, where I basically said China's development success is not a miracle. It's basically what, as a good neoclassical economist, you would expect a country that has a high savings rate, that invests a lot in education, that invests a lot in infrastructure, that mobilizes the process of urbanization and structural transformation effectively, and that is highly export-oriented. All of these things you would predict without knowing anything about industrial policy to be quite strong predictors of economic success. So, it stands to reason whether the particular Chinese approach to development was the main reason, or whether these other ingredients were what drove China's extraordinary performance. And similar arguments have been made for other parts of East Asia. So this is my basic agreement. Now, nonetheless, I'm not sure all the skeptics will be convinced. And I think the argument potentially remains incomplete in a number of areas. The first is economies of scale. So one thing that China has done very effectively is to utilize the huge scale of its domestic market as a means to lure foreign investors and as a means to achieve economies of scale that made it competitive or that allowed it to achieve competitiveness in industries from a position where they weren't initially competitive. So where the temporary protection argument, which goes all the way back to List, worked very effectively. Now, is that specific only to large countries, or is that something that smaller countries can also do? And my sense is it's specific to large countries. I mean, you may be able to do it in smaller countries if you band together, if you have regional integration, but how you achieve regional integration and then industrial policy is not entirely clear. So scale economies clearly matter, and I don't know to what extent, and I don't know in which industries, and it might be good to have a bit more research on that. The second is that you mention the evidence that robotization, or the automation of tasks in manufacturing, is not necessarily bad news for developing countries, but then you mention a number of caveats. But I think in one of your papers, you actually introduce another argument why developing countries are worried about manufacturing, which is that the demand for manufacturing products tends to grow less rapidly than productivity. You have the Baumol effect that because productivity growth in manufacturing tends to be relatively fast, but demand growth tends to be relatively limited over time. But more and more employment gravitates to services, and I would have thought that that's true globally as well. So if China has become extraordinarily competitive in global manufacturing, almost across the entire skills range, and global demand for manufacturing isn't going to grow dramatically, how much space is there for African countries, for instance, to enter into that market? To me, that remains a bit of an open question, whether that effect is important, even if the robotization concerns are not as relevant as some people fear. And third, this has a lot to do with what the large emerging markets, and again, talking about China, are going to do themselves in terms of opening their markets to the products of developing countries. China, of course, has opened its markets to developing countries, but predominantly in the supply of commodities and intermediates, and not in the supply of manufactured products. Now, as China gets richer, will it become a target market? If you advise developing countries to target rich countries, what are you talking about? Are you talking about the United States and Europe, or are you talking and Japan and Korea, or are you also talking about China? And to me, there your advice is not entirely clear, because the rich countries may give you the best opportunity to upskill and to learn and to invest in higher quality, but they may not be growing very fast. So how do you trade off a market that grows at 5, 6, maybe 10% a year against the market that grows at 1 to 2% a year? Do we have any evidence to know what the threshold is? How far away does your in terms of per capita income, does your destination export market need to be from your current level of income for that to be an attractive market into which to export? And if we were, to advise China on the role that it wants to play in the global economy, do we want to be arguing in favor of a China that becomes the new possibility for countries to step up the manufacturing ladder? If that's the case, then we ought to be concerned by the fact that China has emphasized in its latest 14th five-year plan that it wants to maintain the share of manufacturing in its GDP, and it's very worried itself about deindustrialization. And so that may create less opportunities than it otherwise would, leaving the developing countries to export to markets that aren't growing very fast. So it'd be useful to hear from you on that. And then the final comment that I would make is to hear a bit more about what does service-led export development look like, and what does it depend on? So if this concern that productivity growth is highest in manufacturing, and convergence of productivity is fastest in manufacturing, and therefore manufacturing is the quickest route towards accelerated development and towards economic convergence, what do we know about service-based growth strategies and convergence strategies? Do we have any evidence at all from countries like India that have tried to do that, and what does it depend on? So if you're slightly skeptical, or caveats regarding robotization and the scope for manufacturing-led development are true, whether because of political backlash or because of the fact that robots get better and better. And if my skepticism about whether demand for manufacturing products will grow fast enough to create these opportunities is true, so what is our advice for countries that want to develop a service-based strategy? Is that possible in substitution to a manufacturing-based strategy? Can you leapfrog straight into a service-based strategy? Is not clear to me. I'm not sure we have a lot of evidence. The only one that I can think of is India. But I do know that in most developing countries that I've looked in, hello? The services sector tends to be a lot less open and tends to be a lot more protected and a lot more regulated. So it's not clear to me that there's a lot of countries that are, that are systematically looking at the services sector as despite outside of tourism perhaps, but as a service-based export strategy. So I'll leave it at those three sort of qualifying remarks. But overall, I think I really enjoyed the presentation. I enjoyed reading some, not all, of the papers referenced in it. I think it's a very solid research agenda, and I think overall I agree with the conclusion that that too much has been made of a possible alternative development path, and I don't think the evidence stands up strong enough to support that alternative development path. But I think we may need to do a bit more work to convince the skeptics that we're right. So let me stop at that. Thank you.
Thanks, Martin. So, Paulo, before turning it over to sort of open Q&A, do you want to have maybe a chance to respond to some of the points that Martin raised? Perhaps just to summarize in shorthand, the notion of scale economies, are they necessary? The role of demand for manufacturing products, sort of the openness of markets in some of these high growth economies, and then the service, what does service-led development look like? And if you want to take any or all of those.
Thank you very much, Martin, for the insightful discussion. So indeed, as I mentioned, the theoretical arguments for supporting infant industries are there, and scale economies are part of it. I think the difficulty really lies in being able to identify the industries and the firms that you should support. And so I think the evidence suggests that you can achieve that objective by embracing openness and benefiting from the scale economies through growth in export markets and through attracting relatively large foreign firms from which local firms can also then grow. Doesn't mean that you should completely ignore that some sectors have more potential for spillovers or more potential for generating scale economies. But my reading of the evidence so far and the history of development of several countries that tried industrial policy with protection is really that it did not produce overall good results. It's true that a number of countries in East Asia have adopted a mixed approach, but we really don't know if, I believe the evidence suggests that the biggest benefits came from the great export orientation, the great openness, the fact that China used initially special economic zones to attract multinationals to export to other countries, and then gain enough scale to generate an internal market that now is becoming stronger indeed, but that would not be there most likely without the trade-led growth in the beginning. In terms of demand for manufacturing, I think we still see evidence that although China, because it's growing and it's becoming richer, is turning more into services, which is natural, we see evidence from lower income countries in sub-Saharan Africa that they are growing their export manufacturing share of employment. So we don't see evidence that this path is no longer there despite industrial robots. And when I mention richer markets, of course, I would include several parts of China that are growing and quite rich. So I would not exclude those parts. But my point was more that if governments are resource constrained and they need to decide where they have to allocate their efforts of export promotion, choosing markets that have greater potential for learning is a good idea. This does not mean that you should ignore markets that are growing, and exports can also have other effects, as I mentioned, through scale effects. So just exporting allows firms typically to adopt technologies and grow, and this in itself, even without the benefits of learning, can be important. So I would not, of course, recommend ignoring a fast-growing market like the Chinese market, also because it has a number of markets inside China that are quite high income and where there is a lot of potential for quality upgrading through exports. In terms of services-led development, I think in the early stages of development, manufacturing still plays really an important role, but we should not underestimate at all the potential for services-led development. I think we need to examine this case by case. The evidence that we have is that, for example, in China, in India and in the Philippines, exports of services in, for example, information technology, call centers were important, generated sizable growth and employment. There is, I think, more potential to exploit this increase in remote work all across the globe through the pandemic to also directly export services through digital platforms, potentially attract offices of multinationals to do that, because multinationals are often reluctant to share their data and share their secrets, so they will want to do that in-house. But there is a lot of potential, and I think the evidence that we have so far is not abundant, but the evidence that we find is encouraging. I do not find a trade-off that you need to go through one route or the other. I think it's possible to continue to foster manufacturing-led development, especially in the early stages, and be open to services-led opportunities as they arise. I don't see there necessarily a trade-off, and I believe that if manufacturing generates less jobs than before, it's going to be in part because firms in developing countries are automating earlier, and that generates income growth that will allow for demand to emerge in services inside the countries, as it is happening now in China, in those countries. So that's not necessarily a bad outcome, but it will matter if those workers move to work in, say, informal services or restaurants or small cafes, or if they will work in high-skilled services sectors with potential for exports. So that I think we need to pay a lot more attention to.
Thanks, Paulo. I'm going to now turn to people who've put questions in the chat and ask you to maybe put those questions to Paulo. Martin, if you want to come in after Paulo on any of the questions, you're welcome to. So I'm going to take a few. I see Romain Duval, Galena, Vikram Nehru, and Daria. So maybe we should take all four, since those are the four that have come so far, and please be succinct, and then we'll turn it back to the to Paulo and Martin. So Romain.
Yes. Hi. Can you all hear me? Yeah, I'm Romain Duval from the IMF Research Department. No, great talk, Paulo. But I had a question, which is, we've all struggled, right, for 20 years regarding the lack of growth in Mexico, right? And it seems to me that at least part of the Mexican economy, the one that's really trade exposed and benefited from NAFTA, should have benefited from the kind of, virtuous circle that you laid out, right? This, exposure to a rich country, so quality upgrading on the input side that leads to the same on the output side, and followed by worker training and, and some convergence. And so the question would be, I know that Mexico has zillions of other problems that one would need to control for us, but if you forget about those and focus just on the part of the Mexican economy that's been really exposed, right, to NAFTA and integration with the US, do you see the kind of evidence that you found from the other micro studies that you mentioned for different countries in all these top papers? Thanks.
Thanks, Romain. So I'm going to change a little bit what I said before, because Ottaviano has been very active in the chat. So I'm going to actually separate. Let's go with Romain, Galena, and Vikram, and then we'll take a pause, and then I'll go to Daria and Ottaviano. If you want to come in, I'll give you a chance then. So thanks, Romain. Galena, would you like to ask your question? Galena, are you still there? Okay, I will maybe just put the question, Galena's question, which are the... Oh, you're there?
No, thank you. No.
Okay, there you are. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead, Galena.
No, answer. I don't have questions.
Okay. Well, I guess there is. Let me try to reframe what Galena raised, which are the political factors. And you raised a little bit the political factors in relation to backlashes to tax policy. But I wonder whether you wanted to come back a little bit more to, you focus very much on the positive sides, and there are sort of the potentially negative political factors going on, and maybe just your reflection on that. Vikram, do you still want to ask your question?
Well, thanks, Dion. it's a bit redundant my asking the question since it's already down in the chat box. But basically, what can and should developing countries adopt undervalued exchange rates to promote trade and manufacturing-led development? And I just want to add that I appreciate Ottaviano's response, although I would still have questions as to the 4 preconditions that he indicated. But I'd like Paulo's response to this. Thank you very much.
Thanks on this, Paulo, and maybe Martin, if you'd like to come in on those first 3 questions.
Sure. Thanks for the question. On Mexico, so there is some evidence that there was a response as we would expect in the beginning with the maquiladoras and significant industrial development. But indeed, there were a number of factors that seemed to get in the way. One of them was the fact that, unlike in East Asia, where those initial revenues and income that arise from exports led to very rapid skill upgrading of younger generations. So parents that got a manufacturing jobs used those jobs to put their children in school. And so there was really rapid skill upgrading across generations. In Mexico, there is evidence, a paper by David Atkin in the ER suggests that those manufacturing jobs actually led some people to drop out of school. And so different perceptions about the benefits of education might have interacted with this development process in the longer term. Another factor is that when Mexico was specializing in a number of sectors because of integration with the US, China got into the picture and Mexico had to compete with China as well. And so this created an adjustment problem that was difficult for the Mexican economy. And finally, there are indeed a number of other issues in Mexico. Santiago Levy, for example, argues that because of informality, a lot of taxes fall on larger firms, so firms don't really have the option to grow there because then they will be taxed away very quickly, and this drags down productivity and makes firm size smaller in Mexico than you'd like it to be. But this is an important question, and it's still being subject to a lot of interest, and it's difficult to identify all the causes. But I think some of the papers on upgrading are actually based on Mexico, so the evidence is there, but there were other factors interacting with those benefits and eroding the gains. With regard to political factors, indeed, market access in rich countries for developing countries is key. So I think the way to address the problems, distributional consequences of automation and trade and technological change more general, it's quite hard to distinguish between them. Several technologies are imported, and it's hard to identify if a job was lost because of the technology or because of trade. And so politicians typically don't blame robots, they blame other countries. And it's easier to raise tariffs and to say that you're doing something against it than to actually address the fundamental problem, which is one of more inclusive labor market policies, more inclusive tax policies that the political equilibrium did not generate in a number of countries. With regard to undervalued exchange rates, there is evidence that exchange rates indeed can promote exports, but on the other hand, they will make your imported inputs more expensive. And in the beginning, it's quite important to have access to relatively inexpensive inputs, in particular technologies and other materials. So I would say that it's not the ideal strategy to promote export-led growth, because there is this interplay between exports and imported inputs, and by undervaluing your currency, you're also making your imported inputs more expensive.
Thanks, Paulo. Martin, did you want to come in on any of these?
Oh, I agree with what Paulo said. I think the price of inputs, particularly on Vikram's question, the price of input matters, so I think to Ottaviano's point on wage profit distribution, I mean, to me that's the same thing as the exchange rate, right? So if you manage to keep your wage growth significantly below your productivity growth, then obviously your exchange rate will be cheaper. But again, I mean, you pay a price for that. And China has been trying to get to a more consumption-based growth path for quite almost 2 decades now, and it has its disadvantages, I would say.
Thanks. Okay, so let's go to the next 3 questions, and then it looks like we may even have time for another round after this. But so I'll call on Daria, and then Ottaviano, do you want to come in? I'll just give you a chance, and then Yevgenis also raised a question in the chat. So Daria, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, thank you, Paulo, for the talk, and Martin for the excellent comments as well. My question is, I really would like a reflection from the 2 of you on the fact that, since we are working more and more with input-output tables, we do see as a stylized facts that a lot of the high productivity manufacturing has a lot of services content, and a lot of the high productivity services are really services that rely on a lot of capital goods, and in particular the digital goods. So, something that we have been saying for a long time, but I think this evidence supports, is that separating services from manufacturing is largely a statistical artifact. And I think perhaps would be useful to think of ways we can overcome that. And I think in the end, the question is at that very critical stage. We have learned so far, and it's something that we also showed in the WDR, that the rate of growth that countries experience when they move from commodities to basic manufacturing is very large and is not reproduced later in other stages of development at that pace. But on the one hand, I think there is some work to do on looking at level effects. And the second one is to ask what kind of eventually services manufacturing combination can deliver large scale number of jobs for little skilled workforce. And I think, I think Paulo mentioned some avenues to look for additional research, but I do think it's definitely an area where we can learn a lot still. Thanks.
Thanks, Dario. Ottaviano, did you want to come in?
Very briefly, thank you, Paulo, for a great presentation. And thanks, Martin, for your also nice comments. Just to reinforce 2 points. The story about Mexico. It's one chapter of the tale. We all know now about what it takes for a country to seize the opportunity to go up the ladder. And in Mexico, like Brazil, has missed it. The Asians have done it well because they seized the opportunity to upgrade the levels of education, and also they did the change in the business environment that make possible are compatible with capital wealth accumulation and so on. Mexico didn't. Look, Santiago Levy hammers the point. You had one side beautifully ring-fenced from the old Mexico in the northern, and by the way, this responds to the comment about special processing zones. Special processing zones, they may help in that limited range, but when it comes to the country as a whole, you need to have those complementary reforms that allow the country to go up the ladder of income, everything of the middle income trap, education, business environment, infrastructure, and so on. And Mexico didn't do it. The telecommunications, the reform on the oil sector, and so on, everything remained the same, including the informality. Second point I'd like to make is the following, hammering again on the issue of the exchange rate, depreciation, and so on. We cannot look simply at the exchange rate as a compartment. You have to see the whole macroeconomic consistent package, as it was in the case of China. You have to live with that wage compression. Once Lula was, when he was president, he was introduced this idea by Bressa Pereira and Nakano in Brazil. And Lula said, well, wait, do you think I would convince the Brazilian workers to accept the level of real wages of Bangladeshi, with due respect? No. There are preconditions for such a exchange rate based project to yield fruits, and they apply to the lower scale of value added of the value chains. So they are limited when they can. This idea has been sold in Latin America very often in the last few decades. Danny Roderick has done it. And think, history does not repeat. You cannot transplant these ideas out of context. And finally, superb. I'm dying to read the paper, the report. I guess it complements those tales extremely well with the very important fundamental trouble in the making. The trouble in the making set out a sufficiently variegated picture of the issues, and no simplistic answer comes from the trouble in the making. And I think it's one takeaway that we can have from the very rich empirical analysis that has been presented. Thank you. Congrats.
Thanks, Ottaviano. So I'll ask one more person in this round, and then we have two people who I'll come to in the next round who have one with the raised hand and one with a question in the chat. So Yevgenis, do you have a question for this, the last third question for this round?
Yes, thanks, Dion, and thanks, Paulo and Marty, for excellent presentation and comments. My question is mainly about the distribution aspects which were mentioned, but in my view, too much concerns were about growth and less so about the distributional aspects of trade policies. And my observation is driven largely by what happened recently in the United States, where I think the main issue of trade and protectionist policies were the distributional, because we saw that some areas, urban areas, high productivity areas and services benefited from status quo, and rural, semi-urban areas in manufacturing in the Midwest suffered. So what previous administration did, they said, okay, we're gonna cut tax rates on labor and capital, so that generates growth, exactly as Marty suggested in his comment. But we're going to play with tariffs to do redistribution of wealth, so that manufacturing workers can benefit disproportionately more than the services workers. And now this administration reversed essentially these policies and said, okay, no, what we're going to do, we're going to instead rise the taxes and redistribute wealth coming from the tax proceeds, in terms of, infamous paycheck. And possibly, although it's unclear, reverse trade policy so that the tariffs are removed. So in that sense, the question is, which policy would in your view, Paulo, work better in terms of achieving better and equitable outcomes? And maybe one more small concern is that previous administration choked mainly taxes on capital, which actually increases automation because capital becomes cheap. So maybe disproportionately greater cuts on labor and trade could have produced more equitable outcomes. Just to speculate. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Paulo. Any reaction to those interventions?
Yes. So Daria's question about whether it's possible to, or it's difficult to distinguish between manufacturing and services. I agree. I think indeed the evidence suggests that in the United States, for example, one of the reasons why the manufacturing share of employment fell so much is because firms started to outsource tasks like accounting and cleaning services and other tasks that were previously done inside the firm to other specialized firms that are then classified as services firms. And of course, there are many inputs that manufacturing firms use from what are now classified as services firms, but the technology of production did not necessarily change much. It is more an agency issue that rather than doing it inside the firm, now you're doing it with a third party. And also many goods, technological goods like iPhones or smart TVs sell services inside them. For example, you can buy an application inside an iPhone. The iPhone itself is a manufacturing good, but the application is a service. And so it's becoming harder and harder to distinguish between the two. And indeed, we have to be careful in labeling one sector and the other, because the two are highly interlinked through input-output linkages. And I think, yeah, research going forward, we have to take that into account and more try to really look at that beyond these classifications that can be a bit misleading. On Ottaviano's point, I think I agree with the general points. That I think trade and openness brings an opportunity, but then you have to do a lot of other things in order to benefit in the longer term. And if you don't do them, then these are going to be relatively short-lived gains, and it's going to be more difficult to move from the middle income trap that many countries have settled in. With regard to the distributional aspects, all the theory of international trade and quantitative models show that trade generates gains. There is a discussion about the size of the gains, but then it's a matter of how to distribute them. So raising tariffs will be the wrong answer, because you will erode those gains. So essentially you are using, you're eliminating the gains to address the distribution of those gains. So it's much better to really preserve the gains from trade, but then use policies that you have inside the country, tax policies, labor market training, etc., to really address the distributional consequences. In a number of high-income countries, the political equilibrium did not lead to that result, but that would be my advice, and I think that's a fair amount of consensus among trade economists and economists in general, that would be the right way to address the distributional consequences.
Thanks, Paulo. Martin, if you don't mind, I'm going to give the last two people a chance to ask questions, and then maybe turn it back to both you and Paulo for some concluding reflections. So I think Mpumelelo, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, thank you. My question is about the concept of premature the industrialization by Danny Rothschild. I don't know if you engaged with this in the beginning. I wasn't able to connect then, but I just wanted to get a sense of your thoughts on countries looking to industrialize through manufacturing, and the evidence that Rothschild presents that countries are losing shares in employment and value added at an earlier stage than the Asian countries did when they industrialized. Thank you.
Thanks. And then Elsadig?
Okay, thank you very much indeed. This is Sadiq Musa Ahmed. I'm from Multimedia University, Malaysia. Thank you very much for very wonderful and excellent presentation. I heard a lot of talk about productivity actually, but is much explained about productivity. As you know, the difference between the countries and even difference between manufacturing and services, the difference in productivity. And when we talk about just input, because there is input driven that is experienced by most of the Asian countries, and they don't make the difference. And that is a productivity driven experience by individualism by China, Japan, Korea, and so on. So can you please tell us what productivity makes the difference in your presentation? More explanation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Maybe Paulo, first over to you, and then Martin, maybe I'll give you the final word. Paulo?
So on premature deindustrialization, so Roddick's paper, I think, established the fact that developing countries are now observing losses in the share of manufacturing in total employment earlier than other developing countries did in the past. He calls it premature, but that's kind of a normative judgment that is not supported by the paper. So I think there are a number of explanations, and I mentioned already some, why countries may peak their employment in manufacturing early on now. One of them is indeed that firms start adopting technologies earlier on. Technologies have changed, that are cheaper automating technologies and other technologies that replace labor that firms start to adopt in order to be competitive. But again, this is not necessarily a bad outcome because it generates productivity gains and generates income that is then channeled to consumption in services that generates more jobs. I think the concern arises when those jobs in services are not high productivity jobs, are not high quality jobs that employ skilled workers that lead to then growth through services as well. And I think that goes also to the other question, what productivity matters in manufacturing and service. I wouldn't divide it in manufacturing and service. I think both sectors have the potential to have highly productivity firms. We saw evidence, for example, in services, many multinationals operate in finance, in tech. Tech firms are actually the ones that prospered the most with the pandemic. So if these firms come to developing countries and have, for example, an office to take care of their data that they are expanding a lot, those will be relatively high skilled jobs that are likely to be highly productivity jobs that are likely to be well paid jobs and to provide learning opportunities. So I would not easily categorize jobs in manufacturing and services. I think we have to look carefully at the firms and tasks that are being performed inside those sectors. And as Dario mentioned, it's actually not so easy to divide between manufacturing and services because of input-output linkages.
Thanks, Paulo. So Martin, if you had any sort of closing remarks you'd like to make before I conclude?
I would perhaps just say the following. I think Paulo, you presented a strong empirical basis for the kinds of policies that we in the bank have long advocated, which is, a combination of open markets and strong attention to horizontal policies. I think what we didn't focus a lot on in this talk, but which I think a lot of countries might be interested in, even when they buy the basic message, is, how do we get the micro interventions right? So, in Brazil, in the 4 years that I was there was a significant shift in the political climate towards more openness, and people like Senai and a number of the other institutions were really interested to try and find out how they can do better in their existing policies. And I think you mentioned in your talk the importance of continuous monitoring and evaluation. I do think a lot of our clients have a set of instruments at their disposal that they want to use effectively. We can get sidetracked into the big debates versus protectionism and openness and industrial policy or not. And maybe it's good to remember that very often the problem may not be in, well, even when the overall strategy is right, you can get the micro interventions wrong. And so it's important to pay some attention to those. But I know that there is a parallel, a lot of research going on in DEC and elsewhere on these questions. So it's just to mention one point that didn't feature very prominently in the debate, which in my experience is important. But thank you very much. Otherwise, enjoyed the discussion. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone. And thanks especially to Martin for joining us from a 12-hour time difference. Thanks, Paulo, for that great presentation. Thanks to both for your really insightful contributions, and to everyone for your questions. I think it was very enlightening and allowed us to probe some of the issues that Paulo raised. So with that, let me close the session. We'll keep the WebEx open a little bit. If anybody's interested in copying some of these links that people have put, Ryan has put a couple of links related to this session and the upcoming policy research talks. I see Konstantin has put some references that people might be interested in. So if anyone wants to copy those. But with that, let me close the session and thank you all for participating. Thanks, and have a good day or good night. Bye.
Thank you.